October 15th, 1805, and the grey autumn light fell upon the assembly hall like a sentence of judgment, casting long shadows across the 23 children arranged in a single row against the peeling wall. Eleanor Ashford stood 7th from the left, her thin grey wool dress offering nothing against the cold that seeped through the draughty windows, and she could feel the familiar ache in her left leg that always worsened when the weather turned, that leg which dragged behind her with every step she took, marking her as damaged, as lesser, as the one who would not be chosen. She was 12 years old, and had survived 4 years in the Whitmore home for foundling children, 4 years of thin gruel and thinner blankets, of learning to make herself small and quiet and invisible, though her mind refused such diminishment even when her body could not escape it. The prospective patrons filed past them like buyers at a livestock market, which Eleanor supposed they were, examining teeth and hands and the straightness of spines, and she watched a stout merchant's wife select the prettiest girl, watched a farmer claim the 2 strongest boys, watched child after child led away to uncertain futures that were none the less futures, while she remained rooted to her spot, her leg aching, her chin lifted in defiance of the pity and dismissal she saw in every passing glance. The whispers reached her ears as they always did, carried on currents of casual cruelty from the well-dressed ladies who attended these placement auctions as a form of charitable entertainment. Such a shame about that leg. One murmured, she might have been tolerable otherwise. Another responded with a delicate shudder, who would take on such a burden? And Eleanor let the words wash over her like the cold rain that had begun to tap against the windows, because she had learned that tears were a luxury she could not afford, and rage was a fire she must keep banked deep within her chest. The afternoon wore on, and the room emptied, and still Eleanor stood, one of the last 5 remaining, the unwanted, the imperfect, the ones who would be returned to their narrow cots and their hollow hopes for another month, another year, perhaps forever. And then she saw him, the tall figure in mourning black, who had stood apart from the others all afternoon, his face carved from some pale stone of grief, his dark eyes holding a distance that spoke of losses she could not fathom. Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornfield, had not examined a single child, had not spoken to the matrons, had simply watched with an expression that seemed to find the entire proceeding distasteful, and Eleanor had dismissed him as another observer come to feel virtuous about the plight of the poor. But now he moved, crossing the room in long strides, and he stopped directly before her, and for one terrible moment their eyes met, and Eleanor saw something flicker in that grief-stricken gaze, something that might have been recognition. He turned to the waiting matron and spoke the words that would cleave Eleanor's life in 2, his voice flat and cold and utterly without ceremony. "I will take the lame one." The carriage that bore Eleanor away from the only life she had known smelled of leather and wealth and something else, something she would later recognize as sandalwood, but which in that moment seemed to her the very scent of uncertainty, of futures that could not be predicted or controlled. The Duke of Thornfield sat across from her in the velvet darkness, his long legs taking up more than their share of the space between them, and he had not spoken a single word since lifting her into the carriage, with hands that were surprisingly gentle for a man whose face seemed carved from winter itself. Eleanor pressed herself into the corner of the seat, making her body as small as possible, a skill she had perfected in 4 years of institutional survival, and she watched him from beneath lowered lashes, cataloguing every detail because information was currency, and she had learned to hoard it like a miser hoards gold. His mourning black was not the cheap dye that faded to rusty brown, but the true deep black of expensive wool, and though the fabric showed signs of 3 years' wear at the cuffs, the cut spoke of London tailors and old money. On his right hand he wore a signet ring bearing a crest she did not recognize, a raven in flight above what might have been a shield or a heart, the gold worn thin on one side, as though he had the habit of turning it when lost in thought, which he did now, his fingers moving in an unconscious rhythm that Eleanor found almost hypnotic. The rain that had threatened all afternoon now fell in earnest against the carriage windows, and in the grey light she could see the lines of grief etched around his mouth, the shadows beneath eyes that stared at nothing, and she understood with the terrible clarity of a child who has learned too young that adults are not always to be trusted, that this man had not chosen her out of kindness, but out of some private obligation she could not fathom. The miles passed in silence. 4 hours of wheels turning and horses' hooves and rain drumming, and Eleanor felt London fall away behind her like a skin she was shedding, felt the countryside rise up green and golden even in October, felt the road narrow and the trees grow thicker, and still the Duke did not speak, did not explain, did not offer even the smallest reassurance about what awaited her at this Thornfield Hall she had heard the matron mention with such obvious deference. And then the carriage crested a hill, and Eleanor saw it for the first time, rising from the dusk like something from the fairy stories her mother had told her before the fever came, before everything changed. A great house of grey stone, with windows that caught the last light of day and threw it back like a challenge, and she felt her breath catch in her throat, felt something that might have been terror, or might have been wonder, and beside. And her the Duke stirred at last, his voice rough with disuse when he finally spoke. "Welcome to Thornfield, Miss Ashford," and it was the first time anyone had ever called her Miss, had ever granted her the dignity of that small, formal title, and Eleanor tucked the word away like a secret, like a promise, like the first fragile seed of hope she had allowed herself to feel in 4 long and lonely years. The great doors of Thornfield Hall swung open to reveal a world Eleanor had only glimpsed in the faded illustrations of books she had once been punished for reading, a world of marble floors that gleamed like frozen milk in the lamplight, and walls hung with portraits of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow her limping progress across the entrance hall with expressions of aristocratic disapproval. A woman emerged from the shadows, round and soft, and wrapped in a dress of practical grey wool that was nonetheless finer than anything Eleanor had ever owned, and her face held the careful blankness of a servant who has learned to reserve judgment until circumstances reveal themselves more fully. "Mrs. Fleming," the Duke said, his voice carrying that same flat exhaustion Eleanor had noted in the carriage. "This is Miss Ashford, and she is to be given the blue room in the East Wing and treated as my ward, not as a servant, do I make myself clear?" And something flickered across the housekeeper's face. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion, before she dipped into a curtsy and murmured, "Of course, Your Grace," as though young girls with dragging legs appeared on the doorstep of ducal estates as a matter of routine. The Duke did not wait for further response, but turned and vanished into the darkness of a corridor that seemed to swallow him whole. And Eleanor was left alone with this Mrs. Fleming, whose eyes now examined her with an intensity that felt almost maternal in its thoroughness. "You look half-starved, child," the housekeeper said, and there was warmth beneath the briskness of her tone, warmth that Eleanor did not trust because she had learned that kindness was often the mask that cruelty wore when it wished to wound more deeply. She was led up a staircase wide enough for 6 to walk abreast, past a portrait of a young woman with golden hair and eyes the colour of spring leaves who seemed to gaze down at Eleanor with something like sorrow, past doors that opened onto rooms she could not begin to imagine the purpose of, until at last Mrs. Fleming stopped before a door painted the soft blue of a robin's egg and ushered her inside. The room was larger than the entire sleeping quarters of the Whitmore home, larger than the cottage Eleanor dimly remembered from before her mother died, and in its centre stood a bed draped in coverlets of cream and pale blue, a bed with pillows, a bed meant for one person alone. Mrs. Fleming left her with promises of supper and hot water and explanations that would come with morning light, and when the door closed, Eleanor stood frozen in the centre of this impossible space, listening to the storm that had broken over Thornfield Hall, thunder rolling across the countryside like the voice of some ancient and indifferent god. She moved to the bed, as though approaching a wild creature that might startle, and when her fingers touched the sheets, she found them soft, impossibly soft, softer than her mother's hands had been in those final fevered days. And Eleanor Ashford, who had not wept in 4 years, felt one single tear trace its way down her cheek and fall upon the pillow that was hers, that was truly and only hers, for the first night in all her memory of nights. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. 5 days had passed since Eleanor's arrival at Thornfield Hall, 5 days in which she had moved through the great house like a ghost afraid to disturb the living, eating her meals in the small breakfast room where Mrs. Fleming insisted she take her place at table like a proper young lady rather than hovering by the kitchen door as her instincts urged her to do. And she had seen the Duke exactly twice. Once at dinner on her second evening, when he had appeared looking haggard and distracted and had spoken perhaps 10 words before retreating to his study, and once in the corridor when she had pressed herself against the wall to let him pass, and he had looked at her with those grief-hollowed eyes, as though trying to remember who she was and why she occupied his ancestral home. On this morning, October 20th, 1805, with the autumn sun casting long golden fingers through windows that needed cleaning, and the grounds beyond blazing with the dying fire of leaves preparing to fall, Eleanor found herself drawn to a part of the house she had not yet explored. The north wing where Mrs. Fleming had mentioned the Duke kept his study, and where visitors were not generally encouraged to venture. She told herself she was simply learning the geography of her new world, simply cataloguing the territory as any sensible creature would do. But something deeper pulled her forward, some hunger she could not name, and when she pushed open a door that had been left slightly ajar, she found herself standing at the threshold of the most beautiful room she had ever seen. The library rose before her in 2 towering stories of books, thousands upon thousands of volumes, bound in leather of every color, their spines gleaming with gold lettering that promised worlds she had never imagined. And Eleanor forgot to breathe, forgot her aching leg, forgot everything except the overwhelming realization that more knowledge existed in this single room than she could consume in a lifetime of reading. She did not hear the footsteps behind her, did not sense the presence until a voice spoke, and she spun around so quickly she nearly lost her balance, her hand catching the doorframe as her weak leg threatened to betray her. "You have found my favorite room in the house," the Duke said, and there was something almost warm in his tone, something that had not been there before, and Eleanor saw that he carried a ledger book under one arm and that beside him stood a man she did not recognize, a man of perhaps 50 years with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers who watched her with frank curiosity. "This is Mr. Hastings, my steward," the Duke continued, and then he did something that changed everything, something that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life as the moment she first began to believe that perhaps, she might belong somewhere after all. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice formal and correct and devastating in its simple dignity, "you have my permission to read any book in this library whenever you wish." And Eleanor looked up into his grey eyes and saw something that might have been recognition, might have been respect, might have been the first fragile thread of a connection that would grow to define them both. The first snow of December fell upon Thornfield Hall like a blessing or a burial shroud. Eleanor could not decide which, and she stood at the library window watching the white flakes descend upon the gardens she had come to know so well in her 6 weeks of residence, gardens that now slept beneath their winter blanket as she herself had slept these past weeks, wrapped in comforts she still could not quite believe belonged to her waking life. She had grown stronger in body, if not yet in spirit. The 3 proper dresses Mrs. Fleming had commissioned for her now fitting curves that had begun to emerge from the skeletal frame she had carried from the orphanage, and when she caught her reflection in the darkened window glass, she saw a girl she barely recognized, a girl with color in her cheeks and flesh upon her bones, and something almost like hope flickering in eyes that had known only resignation for so many years. The library had become her sanctuary, and Mr. Hastings had become an unlikely friend, his initial curiosity about the Duke's peculiar ward transforming into something warmer, as he discovered that Eleanor could add columns of figures in her head faster than he could work them on paper, that she asked questions about crop rotation and tenant relations that men twice her age would never think to pose, and he had taken to leaving account books where she might find them, pretending not to notice when she studied them with the intensity of a scholar poring over sacred texts. It was on this December morning, with Christmas preparations beginning to stir the household from its habitual melancholy, that Eleanor descended the servants' stair she sometimes used when her leg ached too fiercely for the grand staircase, and she heard the voices before she saw their owners. Two housemaids whose words floated up to her frozen form like poison carried on winter air. "Poor lame creature," one said, and the other laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and replied that she had heard the Duke took her from some auction like livestock, and was she not the most pitiful charity case ever to disgrace a noble house? And Eleanor stood motionless on the stair, her hand gripping the banister until her knuckles went white, and something old and fierce rose up within her, something that had kept her alive through 4 years of cruelty and deprivation and the daily humiliation of being considered less than human. She descended the final steps with her chin held high and her damaged leg dragging behind her like a banner of survival rather than a mark of shame. And she looked at the two maids who had fallen silent in horror at her appearance, and she said in a voice as cold and clear as the snow falling outside that she had indeed been purchased like livestock, and she had indeed arrived at this house with nothing but a thin grey dress and a leg that would never heal. But she could read Latin and Greek and calculate sums that would make their heads spin, and she would still be here long after they had been dismissed for gossiping about their betters. She did not see Mrs. Fleming standing in the doorway, hand pressed to her heart in surprised admiration, and she did not see the Duke himself, paused in the shadows of the corridor beyond, watching the small, fierce girl defend her own dignity with weapons forged in the fire of survival, and something shifted in his grief-hollowed eyes, something that looked almost like recognition of a kindred spirit who had learned to carry unbearable weight with grace. The dining room of Thornfield Hall blazed with the light of 40 candles on Christmas Eve, their flames reflected in crystal and silver until the room seemed to shimmer with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fires burning in the great hearths. And Eleanor sat at the long mahogany table, feeling small and strange and achingly aware that this was the first Christmas she could remember where she had not been hungry, the first where she wore velvet instead of threadbare wool, the first where someone had thought to place a sprig of holly beside her plate, as though she were a person deserving of small beauties. The Duke sat at the head of the table, closer than protocol demanded because he had ordered her place set near his rather than at the distant opposite end, and between them stretched a feast that would have fed the entire orphanage for a week, roast goose gleaming with its own fat, plum pudding dark and rich with fruit, dishes of vegetables and sauces and breads that Eleanor could not name but ate with a reverence that made Mrs. Fleming smile from the doorway where she supervised the footman. They had spoken little through the meal, but it was a different silence than the empty quiet of those first weeks, warmer somehow, companionable in a way that Eleanor did not quite understand, and when the servants withdrew and left them, alone with their wine and the crackling of the fire, Frederick spoke in a voice roughened by something that sounded like old sorrow. "My wife loved Christmas," he said, and Eleanor saw him turn the gold band on his finger, a gesture she had noticed before but never understood until now, and she knew with sudden certainty that January would bring some terrible anniversary, some date circled in grief on the calendar of his heart. "She died in the new year," he continued, "and our daughter with her, and I have not celebrated this season since. But tonight I find that I am glad not to be alone." Eleanor did not know what to say, so she said the only true thing she had to offer, her voice small but steady in the candle-lit room. "I remember my mother at Christmas. She would make a pudding with whatever scraps we had, and tell me stories of when she was a girl, and I thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and when she died, I thought I would never feel warm again." The Duke looked at her then, with eyes that saw not a lame orphan or a charity case, but a fellow traveller on the road of loss. And he reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper, and Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers to find a mathematics primer, its leather cover soft and new, and inside on the flyleaf an inscription in his own hand that read, "To Miss Eleanor Ashford, whose mind deserves all the world's knowledge." And she pressed the book to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." And something shifted between them in the golden light, something that felt like the first fragile stirring of family, of belonging, of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The years between Eleanor's 13th winter and her 15th spring passed like pages turning in a beloved book, each season bringing new knowledge, new growth, new reasons to believe that perhaps she had not been wrong to hope after all, and she threw herself into learning with a hunger that astonished even Mr. Hastings, who had seen many clever people in his years of service, but none quite like this girl who devoured mathematics texts as other children devoured sweets, and who could explain the principles of crop rotation with more clarity than the agricultural pamphlets gathering dust in the estate office. Frederick brought tutors from London, a parade of learned men who arrived expecting to instruct a charity case, and departed, shaking their heads in wonder at a mind that grasped French irregular verbs and Italian opera lyrics and the complex dance of historical cause and effect with equal facility. And Eleanor grew 4 inches in those years, her body finally catching up to the fierce spirit that had always burned within it, her limp remaining, but transformed somehow into something almost graceful, a distinctive rhythm to her walk that she learned to carry with dignity rather than shame. The estate prospered under attention it had not received since before the late Duchess's death, for Frederick found himself drawn back into the management of his lands through Eleanor's endless questions, her observations about tenant housing and drainage systems, and the mathematics of livestock breeding, pulling him from the fog of grief into engagement with the living world again. And in the spring of 1807 he appeared at breakfast wearing a coat of deep blue rather than morning black. And Eleanor felt her heart leap in a way she did not yet understand, but could not ignore. Mr. Hastings became her unofficial tutor in the practical arts of estate management, spreading account books across the library table and walking her through the Byzantine complexity of rents and repairs and seasonal wages, and by her 14th year she was catching errors in the quarterly accounts that had slipped past everyone else, her quick mind finding patterns in numbers the way other people found shapes in clouds. Society began to whisper, of course, for society always whispers about anything it does not understand, and the Duke of Thornfield's peculiar arrangement with his lame orphan ward provided endless fodder for drawing-room speculation. But the whispers remained distant, unable to penetrate the walls of Thornfield Hall, where Eleanor had found something she had never dared to name, something that felt like home and purpose and the first fragile roots of belonging. Frederick watched her blossom with an attention he did not examine too closely, telling himself that his pride in her accomplishments was merely the satisfaction of a guardian seeing his ward flourish, that his increasing reliance on her judgment in estate matters was simply practical recognition of her abilities, that the way his chest tightened when she laughed at something he said meant nothing at all. And Eleanor watched him emerge from his grief like a man waking from a long illness, never suspecting that she was the medicine that had begun to heal him, never imagining that the foundation being laid in these quiet years would one day support something neither of them yet had the courage to name. The spring of 1809 arrived at Thornfield Hall with an explosion of yellow daffodils that carpeted the gardens like scattered gold coins, and Eleanor walked among them on an afternoon in late March, feeling the soft earth yield beneath her feet and wondering when exactly she had stopped thinking of herself as a guest in this place and begun to feel it as home. Wondering, too, when the sight of Frederick emerging from his study had begun to make her heart perform strange acrobatics that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with something she dared not name, for she was 16 now and no longer a child, her body having transformed in ways that her mind still struggled to comprehend, her reflection in the mirror showing a young woman with serious grey eyes and hair that gleamed copper in certain lights, and a figure that the dressmaker had pronounced quite fashionable despite the limp that would never leave her. She was contemplating a particularly bold daffodil when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered the afternoon peace, and she turned to see an elegant equipage bearing a crest she did not recognize, pulling up to the main entrance, and from it emerged a tall woman with Frederick's dark hair and sharp cheekbones, and an expression that suggested she had come to wage war. Lady Sophia Sinclair had not visited her brother in 4 years, and her arrival now sent the household into barely concealed panic, servants rushing to prepare rooms, and Mrs. Fleming wringing her hands in a way that made Eleanor's stomach clench with unnamed dread. Eleanor was not invited to dinner that evening, a departure from the custom that had developed over years, and she sat alone in her room with a book she could not read, straining to hear voices she could not quite make out, until curiosity overcame propriety, and she crept down the servants' stair to the corridor outside the dining room, where Sophia's voice carried clearly through the door, with words that pierced Eleanor's chest like shards of ice. "This situation is impossible, Frederick," Sophia was saying, her tone sharp and certain. "You have a young woman of marriageable age living unchaperoned in your household, a girl with no family and no connections and a visible infirmity, and society already whispers that your attachment is something far less innocent than guardianship, and I will not stand by while you destroy both your reputation and hers." Eleanor pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself, feeling the world she had built brick by careful brick begin to crumble around her. But then Frederick's voice cut through the darkness, fierce and low and thrumming with an intensity she had never heard from him before, and he said, "Sophia, I will hear no more of this. Eleanor is the finest person I have ever known, and if society cannot see her worth, then society be damned, and I will not send her away. I will never send her away." And in that moment, Eleanor understood 2 things with crystalline clarity: that she loved him with a depth that terrified her, and that whatever they were to each other, it could never be simple again. The 3 days following Sophia's arrival stretched like years for Eleanor, who moved through Thornfield Hall with the careful precision of someone walking across thin ice, avoiding the rooms where she might encounter her accuser, taking meals in her chamber, and wondering if the life she had built was about to crumble into dust. But on the 4th morning, a summons arrived via Mrs. Fleming's kind hands, requesting Eleanor's presence in Frederick's study to discuss estate matters, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was not merely a meeting, but a trial, a chance to prove that she was more than the scandalous charity case Sophia believed her to be. She dressed with particular care in her most modest gown of dove-grey wool, pinned her copper hair into severe order, and gathered the quarterly account books she had been preparing for Mr. Hastings, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest as she made her way down the corridor toward judgment. Sophia sat in the leather chair by the window, her posture rigid with aristocratic disapproval, while Frederick stood by the fireplace looking like a man caught between 2 armies, and Eleanor paused in the doorway long enough to gather every fragment of dignity she possessed before stepping forward and saying in a voice that did not waver, "I understand you have concerns about my position here, Lady Sinclair, and I hope you will permit me to address them directly." The next hour transformed everything, for Eleanor spread the account books across Frederick's desk and walked Sophia through 3 years of careful management, pointing to the 15% improvement in crop yields, the reduction in tenant complaints, the modernization of drainage systems that had increased arable land by 40 acres, the renegotiated contracts with London merchants that had improved profit margins, and as she spoke, she watched Sophia's expression shift from skepticism to surprise to something that looked almost like respect. And when Eleanor finished her presentation, the older woman sat in silence for a long moment before saying in a voice stripped of its earlier sharpness, "You did all of this." And Eleanor replied simply, "Mr. Hastings taught me, and Frederick trusted me to learn, and I have tried to be worthy of that trust." The spring rain began to fall against the windows as Sophia rose and crossed the room to stand before Eleanor, studying her face with new eyes. And then she did something that shocked Eleanor into stillness. She reached out and took Eleanor's hands in her own, her grip firm and warm, and said, "I came here prepared to rescue my brother from a designing fortune hunter, and instead I find the most capable young woman I have ever encountered. And I owe you an apology, Miss Ashford, for judging you by society's shallow standards rather than by your own remarkable merits." Frederick made a sound that might have been relief or triumph, and Sophia turned to him with something like wonder in her expression and said, "She is extraordinary, Frederick, and you were right to defend her, and I will spend the remaining days of my visit learning everything I can about how she has accomplished what a dozen stewards could not." And in that moment, Eleanor understood that she had gained something more valuable than approval. She had gained an ally who would one day help her navigate the treacherous waters of a world that had been designed to exclude people exactly like her. The years between 1809 and 1812 passed like pages turning in one of Eleanor's beloved books, each season bringing new growth and new complications that neither she nor Frederick dared to name aloud, and she watched herself transform from a girl of 16 into a woman of 19, her body settling into its final form while her mind expanded to encompass everything Thornfield demanded of her, and she took on more responsibilities with each passing month until Mr. Hastings began deferring to her judgment on matters of crop rotation and tenant disputes and the complex negotiations with London merchants who had learned to respect the young woman with the copper hair and the steady grey eyes, and the limp that she had long since ceased to hide. Frederick, meanwhile, began spending more and more time in London on what he called business, but what Eleanor recognized as flight, for she had become skilled at reading the tension in his shoulders and the careful distance he maintained when they were alone together, and she understood, with a wisdom beyond her years, that he was running from something that neither of them could acknowledge without destroying the careful fiction of their guardianship. Yet the letters they exchanged during his absences told a different story. 3 letters each week crossing between London and Thornfield, filled with discussions of estate matters that somehow transformed into confessions of loneliness and observations about the absurdity of society, and questions about her reading and her thoughts and her dreams that no guardian should properly ask his ward, and Eleanor kept every letter in a rosewood box beside her bed and sometimes pressed them to her heart in the darkness like a foolish girl in a novel. Sophia became her champion during these years, introducing her to carefully selected members of society at small gatherings where Eleanor's intelligence could shine without the scrutiny of a full season, and the whispers about the Duke's mysterious ward began to shift from scandal to curiosity, from pity to something approaching respect, as word spread of the young woman who had transformed Thornfield into the best-managed estate in the county. Eleanor turned 17, then 18, then 19, and with each birthday, Frederick's gifts grew more extravagant, and his absences grew longer, and she began to understand that he was trying to give her the world while keeping himself at a safe distance from the one thing she truly wanted. In the autumn of 1812, Frederick turned 35, and Eleanor organized a small celebration at Thornfield that brought Sophia and a few trusted friends together, and she watched him blow out candles and accept congratulations, while his eyes kept finding hers across the room with an expression she could not quite decipher. And later that night, when the guests had retired and the house had grown quiet, she found him standing alone in the library where their story had truly begun, and he turned to her with something raw and desperate in his face and said, "Eleanor, I think it is time we discussed your future," and she understood that the careful equilibrium they had maintained for years was about to shatter, one way or another, into something entirely new. The spring of 1813 arrived at Thornfield with an explosion of blossoms that seemed to mock the turmoil in Eleanor's heart, for the conversation Frederick had begun in the library on his birthday had unfolded over the following months into something she had never dared to imagine. A London season, a proper debut, a chance to enter society not as a curiosity or a charity case, but as a young woman of accomplishment and grace. And though the prospect terrified her more than she could express, she understood that this was Frederick's gift to her, his way of opening doors that her birth and her limp and her orphan status had always kept firmly closed. Sophia arrived at Thornfield in early April with trunks full of fashion plates and fabric samples and a determination that bordered on ferocity, declaring that her brother had finally shown sense and that she intended to launch Eleanor into society with such force that every tongue would wag with admiration rather than mockery, and Eleanor submitted to the endless fittings and consultations with a mixture of gratitude and dread that left her sleepless most nights. Frederick commissioned a wardrobe that cost £500 Dömtschens, a sum that made Eleanor's practical mind reel with the extravagance of it, and when she protested that such expense was unnecessary, he silenced her with a look she had never seen before, something fierce and almost desperate, and said only that she deserved to enter every room knowing she was the equal of anyone present. The presentation gown arrived in late April, pale gold silk that caught the light like captured sunlight, and when Eleanor tried it on for the first fitting, she caught Frederick watching from the doorway with an expression that made her breath stop in her throat. And then he turned and walked away without a word, leaving her to wonder what battle was being fought behind those dark eyes. Sophia spoke of society with the casual authority of one who had navigated its treacherous waters for decades, warning Eleanor of the dangers that awaited: the fortune hunters who would see only her connection to the Duke, the matrons who would judge her origins, and most dangerous of all, Lady Beatrice Montague, whose tongue had destroyed more reputations than scandal sheets, and whose cruelty was legendary among those who had felt its sting. The London townhouse was opened for the first time in years, its dust covers removed and its chandeliers polished until they blazed with light. And as Eleanor stood in its grand entrance hall on the evening before her first ball, she felt the weight of everything she was about to face pressing down upon her shoulders like a physical burden. Frederick found her there in the dim light, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, 8 years of shared history hanging in the air between them, and then he said quietly, "You do not have to do this, Eleanor. You owe me nothing." And she replied with a certainty she did not entirely feel, "I am not doing this for you, Frederick. I am doing this because I want to know who I might become." And his smile in response was sad and proud and something else entirely that she dared not name. The assembly rooms at Almack's blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of May 3rd, 1813, and Eleanor stood at the entrance beside Sophia, with her heart pounding so violently she was certain every person in the room could hear it, her pale gold gown catching the light as she had been promised it would, her copper hair dressed with pearls that Frederick had presented to her that morning, with hands that trembled slightly as he fastened the clasp, and she forced herself to breathe as the majordomo announced her name, and 200 faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt to something she could not quite identify. She felt her limp more acutely than she had in years as she descended the 3 steps into the ballroom, each footfall a declaration of her difference, her deficiency, her audacity in daring to enter this glittering world where perfection was the minimum requirement for acceptance. And she heard the whispers begin almost immediately, a rustling tide of speculation that followed her progress across the polished floor like wind through autumn leaves. Lady Beatrice Montague stood at the center of a cluster of silk-clad matrons, her sharp eyes tracking Eleanor's approach with the focused intensity of a predator scenting weakness. And as Eleanor passed within earshot, she heard the words that she had been dreading since childhood, spoken in a carrying whisper designed to wound. "I see Thornfield has brought his lame charity case to market at last. One wonders what price he expects to fetch for damaged goods." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of the auction room 8 years ago, of standing in a line of children while prospective guardians passed her by with pitying glances and dismissive shakes of their heads. And for a moment she felt herself shrinking back into that terrified girl in the thin grey dress, alone and unwanted and certain that she would never be chosen. But then she caught sight of Frederick standing across the room, his tall figure unmistakable in formal black, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression of such fierce protectiveness that it steadied her like a hand pressed to her back, and she lifted her chin and met Lady Beatrice's gaze with a calm she did not feel, and continued her progress into the room as though she had heard nothing at all. The evening might have been an unmitigated disaster had not a young gentleman with golden hair and an easy smile appeared at her elbow during the second dance, introducing himself as Lord Christopher Pembroke and asking with apparent sincerity whether she would do him the honour, and Eleanor accepted with gratitude that bordered on desperation, allowing him to lead her onto the floor where she discovered that her limp mattered less in the dance than she had feared, that the steps she had practiced for months at Thornfield carried her through with something approaching grace. And when she looked up from the final turn, she saw Frederick watching her with Pembroke, and the expression on his face was not protective now, but something darker, something almost like pain. The weeks that followed Eleanor's debut at Almack's unfolded with a swiftness that left her breathless, for the season proved to be nothing like the gauntlet of humiliation she had braced herself to endure, and instead she found herself the unlikely centre of a small but genuine circle of admirers who seemed drawn not to her connection to the Duke of Thornfield, but to something in herself that she had never quite believed others could see. Her wit, honed through years of intellectual conversation with Frederick, and sharpened by the necessity of defending her dignity against casual cruelty, proved to be a currency more valuable in society than she had imagined, and she discovered that when she spoke her mind at dinner parties, or offered observations that cut through the tedious small talk of ballrooms, people listened with an attention that had nothing to do with pity or obligation. Lord Christopher Pembroke was the most persistent of her admirers, appearing at every event she attended with bouquets of hothouse flowers and compliments that flowed as easily as water, his golden hair and easy smile making him the object of envy among the other young ladies of the season. And yet it was Eleanor he sought out. Eleanor whose hand he requested for every dance her leg could manage. Eleanor to whom he addressed his prettiest speeches about the meeting of true minds and the irrelevance of superficial beauty. In a single week she received 12 bouquets, her sitting room transformed into a fragrant garden of roses and lilies and exotic blooms she could not name, and Agnes teased her mercilessly about the gentleman who was so clearly besotted, while Eleanor smiled and accepted the attention with a confusion she could not quite articulate, for when Pembroke looked at her with those earnest blue eyes, she felt only a mild pleasure, a distant gratification, nothing like the storm that gathered in her chest whenever Frederick entered a room. Frederick himself had grown distant in these weeks, his dark eyes following her across ballrooms with an expression she could not read, his conversations with her reduced to brief pleasantries in the presence of others, and she told herself that this was proper, that he was allowing her to make her own way in society, that his withdrawal was a gift of independence rather than a wound. But late at night, in her borrowed bedroom in the London townhouse, she pressed her face into her pillow and ached with a longing she knew she had no right to feel. Sophia pulled her aside after a musicale evening in early June, her sharp features softened with genuine concern, and warned her that Pembroke's family estate was mortgaged to the hilt, that his attentions to the Duke's ward were exciting comment among those who knew his financial circumstances, and Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach, even as she insisted that Sophia was mistaken, that Pembroke had never once mentioned her connection to Frederick, that his interest must be genuine, because surely no one would pursue so determinedly a woman with a limp and an orphan's history unless his feelings were true. The unseasonably warm weather pressed down upon London like a hand, and society's gossip had shifted from mockery of the lame charity case to speculation about whether the Duke would permit his ward to marry a man whose pockets were to let, and Eleanor moved through the glittering rooms, feeling the ground shifting beneath her feet toward something she could not yet name. The garden party at Lady Ashworth's estate on June 15, 1813, unfolded beneath a sky of perfect summer blue, with 200 guests wandering among the rose beds and sipping champagne punch, while Eleanor moved through the crowd in her lavender muslin gown, feeling the weight of watching eyes upon her with every step, and she had almost begun to believe that she might survive the afternoon unscathed, when Lord Christopher Pembroke appeared at her elbow with that familiar golden smile and asked whether she might spare him a moment in private, his blue eyes holding an intensity that made her stomach tighten with something that was not quite anticipation. She had opened her mouth to respond when Frederick materialized beside them, as though summoned by some invisible alarm, his tall figure casting a shadow across Pembroke's sunny countenance, and the look that passed between the two men crackled with an animosity that Eleanor had not fully understood until this moment, when she saw Frederick's jaw clench and Pembroke's easy smile harden into something brittle and defensive. "I believe Miss Ashford has promised this moment to me," Frederick said in a voice that brooked no argument, and Pembroke's laugh was sharp as broken glass as he replied that surely the Duke did not intend to keep his ward on so short a leash forever, that a man might be forgiven for wondering what exactly Thornfield's intentions were toward a young woman he had plucked from an orphan auction 8 years ago. The words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water, and Eleanor felt the ripples of shock spreading outward through the nearby guests, saw Lady Beatrice Montague's face light with savage satisfaction as she stepped forward to add her poison to the wound, her carrying voice ensuring that every ear within 20 feet could hear her declare that she had always wondered what price Thornfield had paid for his little charity case, that she had heard the girl was displayed alongside pauper children and factory cast-offs, that one could dress damaged goods in silk, but one could never truly make them suitable for decent society. Eleanor stood frozen as the whispers erupted around her, as faces turned toward her with expressions of horror and fascination and cruel delight, and she felt 8 years of careful dignity crumbling beneath the weight of her exposed origins, felt herself shrinking back into that terrified child, standing in the auction room with her leg dragging and her heart breaking, and she might have fled entirely had Frederick not stepped forward with an expression of such cold fury that even Lady Beatrice fell silent. When he spoke, his voice carried across the rose garden with the authority of generations, and what he said stripped away every pretense and laid bare a truth that Eleanor had never fully understood. "I chose Eleanor Ashford that day because I saw in her eyes a fire that every person in this garden lacks, a dignity that no cruelty could extinguish, a worth that has nothing to do with the circumstances of birth and everything to do with the quality of soul, and any man who pursues her for her connection to my fortune rather than for her own extraordinary merits reveals himself to be precisely the kind of fortune-hunting scoundrel that Pembroke has just proven himself to be." The carriage ride back to the townhouse passed in a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear nothing but the clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the ragged sound of her own breathing, and she sat pressed against the velvet squabs, with her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, unable to look at Frederick, who sat across from her in the gathering dusk with his jaw set like granite and his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window, and she thought that this must be what drowning felt like, this sensation of the world closing in around her, while everything she had built over 8 years crumbled into dust and ash. The townhouse swallowed them in its quiet elegance, and Eleanor moved through the entrance hall like a sleepwalker, her limp more pronounced than it had been in years, as though her body had forgotten how to compensate, had forgotten how to pretend that she was anything other than the damaged creature Lady Beatrice had named her before 200 witnesses. She made it as far as the blue drawing-room before her legs failed her, and she sank onto the settee with a sound that was half gasp and half sob, pressing her palms against her eyes as though she could hold back the tears that had been building since she stood, frozen in that rose garden, while her past was stripped bare for society's entertainment. Frederick followed her without speaking, and she heard him close the door, heard his footsteps cross the carpet, and then felt the settee dip as he sat beside her, closer than propriety allowed, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and feel the warmth radiating from his body, and when he spoke his voice was rough with an emotion she could not name. "Eleanor," he said, "just her name, nothing more," and she shattered. The tears came then, tears she had not shed since childhood, tears she had forbidden herself during all those years of orphanage cruelty and uncertain charity and desperate striving to prove herself worthy of the life he had given her, and she wept with her face in her hands, while Frederick sat beside her in silence until the clock on the mantel struck 11, and she had cried herself empty. When she finally raised her head, he was kneeling before her, this Duke of Thornfield, this man who could have married any woman in England, kneeling on the carpet of the blue drawing-room with his dark eyes level with hers and an expression on his face that she had never seen before, something fierce and tender and utterly unguarded. "I heard everything they said that day at the auction," he told her, his voice steady, despite the emotion burning in his gaze. "Every cruel word about your leg, every dismissal of your worth. And I chose you not despite what I heard, but because of what I saw. Because when you looked at me across that room, there was fire in your eyes, Eleanor, a fire that nothing and no one had managed to extinguish. And I knew in that moment that you were the bravest soul I had ever encountered, and that I would spend the rest of my life ensuring that no one ever made you feel small again." They returned to Thornfield the following morning, leaving London and its cruel whispers behind them like a fever dream from which they had finally awakened. And Eleanor stood at the carriage window watching the city recede into the summer haze, while something shifted in her chest, some tightness that had lived there for 8 years beginning to loosen its grip as the green hills of the countryside rose up to welcome her home. The 2 weeks that followed were unlike any they had shared before, marked by a new intimacy that expressed itself not in grand gestures but in small moments of connection that accumulated like raindrops filling a vessel, until Eleanor found herself brimming with a hope she dared not name. Frederick no longer retreated to his study when she entered a room, no longer maintained the careful distance that had characterized their interactions since she had grown into womanhood, and instead he sought her company with an openness that left her breathless, appearing at her side in the rose garden where she liked to read, joining her for long walks through the summer meadows, despite the way her limp slowed their progress, sitting beside her in the library as twilight deepened and neither of them reached for candles because the darkness felt like a cocoon protecting something fragile and new. He began calling her Eleanor without the formal miss that had always preceded it, and the sound of her name in his voice, low and warm and intimate, sent shivers down her spine each time until she gathered the courage to respond in kind, whispering Frederick one evening as they sat watching the sun sink below the hills, and the smile that broke across his face was like watching dawn break after an endless night. Sophia wrote from London with reports of the social aftermath, how Lady Beatrice's cruelty had backfired spectacularly when several influential matrons declared themselves appalled by her behavior, how Frederick's passionate defense of Eleanor had become the romantic tale of the season, how the ton was now divided between those who sneered at the lame orphan and those who declared her the most interesting young woman to appear in years. But Eleanor found she cared less about London's opinion with each passing day, cared only about the way Frederick looked at her when he thought she was not watching, the hunger and tenderness warring in his dark eyes, the way his hand sometimes reached toward her before he caught himself and pulled back with an expression of such conflicted longing that her heart ached. On the 14th day he found her on her favorite bench in the rose garden, surrounded by blooms of crimson and white and pale pink, and he sat beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched and asked in a voice that was not quite steady what she thought of marriage, whether she had ever imagined what sort of life she might want, what manner of man might deserve her extraordinary heart. And Eleanor felt the world hold its breath around them as she turned to meet his gaze and saw everything he was not yet saying written plainly in his eyes. The library at Thornfield had always been Eleanor's sanctuary, the place where she had first discovered that her mind could be her salvation. And on this July evening, the room glowed with the amber light of a summer sunset, streaming through tall windows while dust motes danced in golden beams and the scent of old leather and paper wrapped around her like an embrace. And she stood at the window watching the gardens below when she heard the door open and close, and knew without turning that it was Frederick, because she had learned the rhythm of his footsteps years ago, had memorized the way he moved through the world with that particular combination of authority and restraint that was uniquely his. He crossed to where she stood, and stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them charged with 8 years of unspoken words and suppressed longings and careful propriety that had begun to crack like ice beneath spring sunshine. "Eleanor," he said finally, and his voice was rough in a way she had never heard before, stripped of the ducal control he usually wore like armor, and she turned to face him and found his dark eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. "I have spent 10 years mourning what I lost, building walls around my heart so high that I believed nothing could ever breach them. And then a girl with fire in her eyes and a limp she refused to let define her walked into my life and demolished every defense I had without even trying." She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised his hand, not touching her, but hovering near her cheek as though she were something precious and fragile, and continued in that same raw voice. "I told myself I was being charitable when I took you from that auction, told myself I was honoring my late wife's memory. But the truth is, I saw something in you that called to something in me, some recognition of souls that had both learned to survive by refusing to break. And I have loved you, Eleanor, loved you for so long that I cannot remember what it felt like not to love you." The words hung in the air between them, shimmering like heat rising from summer stone, and Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. But these were not tears of shame or sorrow. These were tears of a heart so full it could no longer contain itself, and she whispered his name. Just Frederick, nothing more. But it was enough. He closed the distance between them then, and took her hands in his, and she could feel him trembling, this powerful duke who commanded respect from all of England trembling as he held her work, roughened fingers against his chest where his heart beat wild and urgent beneath the fine wool of his coat. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said, "not because society expects it, or because it would solve the question of your position, but because my life without you in it would be no life at all. Because you are the finest person I have ever known, because I cannot imagine another day of pretending that you are merely my ward, when you are in truth the keeper of my heart, and the home my soul has been searching for since long before I knew you existed." Eleanor had dreamed of this moment in the secret chambers of her heart for so long that now it had arrived she could scarcely believe it was real, could scarcely trust that she was still asleep in her pale blue room, dreaming of impossible things. But Frederick's hands around hers were warm and solid and trembling with emotion too powerful to contain, and his eyes held hers with such desperate hope that she knew this was no dream, knew that every prayer she had whispered into her pillow during 8 years of quiet longing had somehow been answered. She thought of the girl she had been at 12, standing in that cold auction hall with her left leg dragging and her thin grey dress offering no protection against the autumn chill or the cruelty of the world, thought of how she had believed herself worthless, unwanted, destined for nothing more than survival at the margins of a society that had no use for lame orphan girls with no fortune and no beauty and no prospects. She thought of the moment when this man, this impossibly distant duke in his mourning black, had spoken the words that had changed everything. "I will take the lame one," words that had felt like a brand searing her soul with shame even as they saved her life. And she marveled at how those same words had led her here to this golden evening in this beloved library with the man who had become her entire world kneeling before her as though she were something precious. "Yes," she whispered, and then again more strongly because she wanted there to be no doubt, no room, for him to think she was accepting out of obligation or gratitude or any of the practical considerations that might drive a woman of her limited origins to marry so far above her station. "Yes, Frederick, I will marry you, not because you saved me or educated me or gave me a home when I had nothing, but because I have loved you since I was 16 years old, and realized that every book I read was so I could discuss it with you, every skill I learned was so I could stand beside you as something more than a charity case. Every dream I dreamed had your face at the center of it." His breath caught, and she saw tears gather in those dark eyes that had seen so much sorrow. And then he was pulling her toward him, and she was falling into his embrace, and his arms wrapped around her with a fierce tenderness that made her feel, for the first time in her entire life, truly and completely safe. They stayed like that as the sunset faded to twilight, and the twilight deepened to dusk, holding each other in the library that had been the birthplace of her transformation, and when he finally pulled back enough to look at her face, she saw that he was smiling, really smiling, the grief that had shadowed his features for so many years finally lifting like morning mist burning away beneath the rising sun. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life," he said softly, "making certain you never doubt for a single moment how extraordinary you are." And Eleanor laughed through her tears and replied that she intended to hold him to that promise for at least 50 years. The news of their engagement spread through society like wildfire through dry summer grass, and reactions ranged from genuine delight among those who had come to appreciate Eleanor's wit and intelligence to scandalized outrage among those who believed a duke should never lower himself to marry a lame orphan girl, regardless of how many years he had spent educating her. And at the center of this storm of opinion sat Lady Beatrice Montague in her elegant London drawing-room, her thin lips pressed into a line of fury as she contemplated how thoroughly her attempt to destroy Eleanor Ashford had backfired. For instead of ruining the girl, she had merely provided the catalyst for a match that would elevate the orphan to one of the highest positions in England. Frederick and Eleanor remained at Thornfield through July and into August, cocooned in their newfound happiness, while letters arrived daily from Sophia, filled with reports of society's reaction and advice on how to manage their return to London. And Eleanor found herself marveling at how different the world looked now that she no longer had to hide the truth of her heart, how Frederick's hand on her arm as they walked through the gardens sent warmth flooding through her entire body, how his eyes followed her across every room with an expression of such tender devotion that she sometimes had to look away simply to catch her breath. They set the wedding date for September 20, 1813, and the weeks between engagement and marriage passed in a blur of preparations and stolen moments, of conversations that lasted until the candles burned low and touches that grew bolder as the wedding day approached, and Eleanor, who had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of love, discovered that she was capable of a passion so deep and fierce that it sometimes frightened her with its intensity. The wedding itself took place in the small stone chapel at Thornfield, where generations of Ravenscrofts had been christened and married and mourned, and Eleanor walked down the aisle on Mr. Hastings' arm, since she had no father to give her away, her left leg dragging slightly with each step, but her head held high and her eyes fixed on Frederick, who waited at the altar with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. She wore ivory silk trimmed with seed pearls and carried roses from the garden where she had spent so many hours dreaming of this impossible future. And when Frederick took her hands and spoke his vows, his voice shook with emotion but never faltered. And when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Frederick kissed her for the first time, as her husband Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, some final wall crumbling, some last doubt dissolving into certainty. The wedding breakfast that followed was small by ducal standards, only 50 guests including Sophia, who wept throughout the ceremony, and Mrs. Fleming, who had travelled from the servants' hall to witness the girl she had welcomed 8 years ago become mistress of the house, and as Eleanor sat beside her husband at the head of the long table in the great dining room, she thought of the cold auction hall and the thin grey dress, and the voice that had said, "I will take the lame one." And she realized that those words, which had once felt like a brand of shame, had become instead the beginning of everything beautiful in her life. The months that followed their wedding unfolded like pages from a book Eleanor had never dared to imagine herself inhabiting, each day bringing new discoveries about the man she had married, and the depth of happiness that was possible when two souls who had each known such profound loneliness finally found their way to each other. And she learned that Frederick laughed more easily now, that his dark eyes crinkled at the corners when she made some wry observation about the estate accounts, or the latest letter from Sophia, detailing society's ongoing fascination with their union, and she learned that he reached for her in the night, as though even in sleep he could not bear to be separated from her. And she learned that the body she had always considered broken and unworthy could bring and receive pleasure beyond anything she had imagined possible in her most secret dreams. By December of 1813, Eleanor knew that she was carrying Frederick's child, and she waited until Christmas Eve to tell him, choosing that date deliberately because it had been the anniversary of their first moment of true connection. 8 years earlier, when he had given her the mathematics primer inscribed with words that had made her feel seen for the first time in her life, and when she whispered the news to him as they sat before the fire in the same dining room, where they had shared that long-ago Christmas dinner. Frederick wept openly and gathered her into his arms with such trembling reverence that Eleanor found herself weeping too, both of them thinking of the daughter he had lost before Eleanor ever came to Thornfield, both of them understanding that this child would not replace that grief, but would exist alongside it, proof that life could bloom again even in soil that had known such sorrow. Their son William Frederick Ravenscroft was born on a warm July evening in 1814, and Eleanor, who had feared throughout her pregnancy that her damaged body might fail at this most essential task, discovered instead that she was stronger than she had ever known, and when the midwife placed the squalling, red-faced infant in her arms and Frederick knelt beside the bed with tears streaming down his face, Eleanor thought of all the voices that had ever called her worthless, thought of Lady Beatrice and her cruelty, thought of the auction hall and the thin grey dress and the words, "I will take the lame one," and she looked at this perfect child and at the man who loved her, and she understood at last that every moment of pain and shame and loneliness had been leading her here to this room filled with golden summer light and the cries of new life and the future stretching out before her like an endless road of possibility. In the years that followed, Eleanor would bear 2 more children, a daughter named Catherine, after Frederick's first wife, and another son named Thomas, after Eleanor's father, whom she had never known, and Thornfield Hall, which had once been a mausoleum of grief, became instead a home filled with laughter and running footsteps and the sounds of a family that had been built not from obligation, but from the deepest and truest love. Eleanor watched her children grow with a fierce, protective love that sometimes took her breath away, and she found herself studying their limbs as they ran through the gardens of Thornfield, watching William chase Catherine through the rose bushes, while Thomas toddled after them on sturdy legs that showed no sign of the weakness that had marked her own childhood, and she thanked God daily that they had inherited their father's strength, even as she resolved that if any of them had been born with her affliction, she would have loved them no less fiercely and raised them to know their worth, just as Frederick had taught her to know hers. The years between 1814 and 1820 brought changes to Thornfield and to England itself, wars ending and economies shifting and society evolving in ways both subtle and profound. And through it all, Eleanor and Frederick built a life together that became legendary in the county, for its warmth and its unconventionality. For the Duchess, who still reviewed the estate accounts herself, and the Duke, who had been known to roll up his sleeves and help with the harvest when hands were short, and visitors to Thornfield often remarked that they had never seen a great house that felt so much like a home. Lady Beatrice Montague died in 1818 of an apoplexy brought on, some said, by rage at seeing Eleanor's continued social triumph. And Eleanor felt no satisfaction at the news, only a distant pity for a woman who had never known the kind of love that could transform bitterness into joy. And she made certain to send flowers to the funeral, because that was what Frederick would have wanted, and because she had learned that the truest victory over cruelty was not revenge, but the simple act of living well. Sophia became one of Eleanor's dearest friends as the years passed, the sharp-tongued woman who had once questioned her place in Frederick's household, now her most fierce defender, and the beloved aunt to her children, who spoiled them shamelessly and took particular delight in teaching Catherine all the social graces while also encouraging her to speak her mind and never apologize for her intelligence. Mr. Hastings remained at Thornfield until his death in 1819 at the age of 72, and Eleanor wept at his graveside as though she had lost a father, for in many ways he had been exactly that, the man who had seen her potential when she was still a frightened child and had patiently taught her everything he knew about managing an estate and building a legacy, and she named her third son Thomas, in part to honor her unknown father, but also because Hastings had once told her that his own father had borne that name. Mrs. Fleming lived to see all three of Eleanor's children born and pronounced each of them the most beautiful baby she had ever beheld, and when she finally retired to a cottage on the estate grounds, Eleanor visited her weekly with baskets of food and hours of conversation, never forgetting that this kind woman had been the first person at Thornfield to treat her with genuine warmth and to believe that the limping orphan girl might become something more than society's expectations allowed. The summer of 1820 found Eleanor standing in the portrait gallery of Thornfield Hall, a space that had once filled her with such unease when she had first arrived as a frightened child of 12 and had seen the painted eyes of generations of Ravenscrofts gazing down at her, as though questioning her right to walk these halls. But now she stood before the newest addition to the collection and felt only a profound sense of belonging, for the portrait showed her own family. Frederick seated in his favorite chair with William standing proudly at his shoulder, while Eleanor sat beside him with Catherine on her lap and Thomas leaning against her knee, and the artist had captured something true in their faces, the easy affection and the deep contentment of people who had found in each other everything they had ever needed. Frederick came up behind her and slipped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder as he too contemplated the portrait, and Eleanor leaned back into his warmth and thought about how far they had both travelled from that grey October day when he had spoken the words that had changed everything, words that had seemed so devastating at the time, but had been the beginning of all this joy, and she turned in his arms to look up at the face she loved more than she had ever thought it possible to love another person, the silver now threading through his dark hair at the temples, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled at her as he was smiling now, and she thought that at 48 he was more handsome to her than he had been at 28, because now she knew every thought behind those dark eyes and every kindness that lived in that heart. From somewhere in the house came the sound of children laughing, and Mrs. Fleming's voice raised in mock outrage as she discovered some mischief the younger ones had gotten into, and Eleanor smiled, because these sounds were the music of her life now, so different from the silence of the orphanage and the cold whispers of society ballrooms. And Frederick must have known what she was thinking, because he pressed a kiss to her forehead and murmured that their children had inherited her spirit along with her intelligence, to which Eleanor replied that they had inherited his stubbornness and his tendency to believe he was always right, and they laughed together the way they did 100 times a day, the easy laughter of two people who had learned to find joy in the smallest moments because they both remembered what it was to live without joy entirely. Later that evening, as the household settled into its nighttime rhythms and the children were put to bed with stories and kisses, Eleanor sat at her writing desk in the room that had once been Frederick's study, but had long since become their shared space, and she began to write in the journal she had kept since her first year at Thornfield, recording not the events of the day, but the feeling of them, the quality of the light, and the exact shade of Frederick's smile, because she had learned that happiness was not a destination, but a collection of moments, and she wanted to remember every single one. The years continued to unfold like the pages of a beloved book, each chapter bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own small triumphs and quiet revelations, and Eleanor found that the passage of time had a way of softening the sharp edges of old wounds while deepening the colors of present happiness, so that by the time the summer of 1825 arrived, and she stood on the threshold of her 32nd year, she could look back on her life with something approaching wonder at all that had transpired since that grey October afternoon when a grieving duke had spoken 5 words that had seemed like a curse, but had been the beginning of a blessing beyond anything she could have imagined. William was 11 now, and already showing signs of the man he would become, serious and thoughtful like his father, but with a streak of his mother's fierce determination that showed itself whenever he encountered an injustice or witnessed cruelty, and Eleanor had watched with quiet pride as he had befriended the son of one of the tenant farmers, a boy born with a twisted foot not unlike her own affliction, and had insisted that the child be given the same educational opportunities that his mother had received, arguing his case before Frederick with all the passion of a barrister before the King's bench. Catherine at 9 was a whirlwind of energy and opinions, her dark curls perpetually escaping their ribbons and her mind always racing ahead to the next question, the next discovery, the next adventure waiting just beyond the boundaries of proper behavior. And Eleanor saw so much of herself in her daughter's hunger for knowledge and her refusal to accept that there were things a girl should not know or do, and she made certain that Catherine's tutors were instructed to challenge her as they would have challenged any boy of her age and abilities. Thomas at 7 was the dreamer of the family, content to spend hours in the garden sketching flowers or lying on his back watching clouds, and while some might have worried that he lacked his siblings' drive and intensity, Eleanor recognized in him a different kind of strength, the ability to find beauty in ordinary moments and to see the world not as it was, but as it might be. And she cherished his gentle spirit as much as she cherished Catherine's fire and William's resolve. Frederick had grown into the role of father with a grace that still surprised Eleanor sometimes. This man who had once seemed so estant and wrapped in grief now fully present in their children's lives, teaching William to ride and to manage the tenants with fairness, encouraging Catherine's questions even when they challenged propriety, and spending long afternoons with Thomas discussing art and philosophy in terms that might have seemed advanced for so young a child, but which Thomas absorbed with quiet understanding. The bonds between them all had created something Eleanor had never known existed, a family in the truest sense of the word, and she understood now that this was what Frederick had been building all along, from the moment he had chosen her at that dreadful auction, not a charity project, but a foundation for something lasting and true. The autumn of 1825 brought with it a visitor Eleanor had not expected. For one crisp October afternoon, a carriage appeared on the long drive to Thornfield Hall, bearing a crest she did not recognize, and when the occupant emerged, Eleanor found herself face to face with a woman she had not seen in 20 years. Miss Harriet Cole, who had been Harriet the scullery maid at the orphanage, one of the few souls who had shown Eleanor kindness during those dark years before Frederick had spoken the words that changed everything, and now here she stood, transformed by time and circumstance into Mrs. Harriet Whitmore, wife of a prosperous merchant and mother of 4, having tracked Eleanor down through years of careful inquiry because she had never forgotten the fierce little girl with the dragging leg who had shared her bread crusts and taught her letters by candlelight in the cold dormitory they had shared. The reunion was tearful and joyful in equal measure as the two women embraced in the grand entrance hall, where portraits of Ravenscroft ancestors looked down upon this most unlikely meeting, and Eleanor led her old friend to the morning room, where they spent hours trading stories of the paths their lives had taken since that grey October day, when Eleanor had been led away by a silent duke in mourning black, and Harriet wept when she heard of the garden party humiliation, and cheered when Eleanor described Frederick's proposal, and marvelled at the children who came tumbling in to meet their mother's mysterious visitor with all the curiosity of youth. Frederick found them there as the afternoon light began to fade, these two women who had survived the same crucible of poverty, and emerged transformed, and he welcomed Harriet with genuine warmth because he understood what it meant to Eleanor to reclaim this piece of her past, to have proof that the girl she had been still mattered, even as she had become someone her younger self could never have imagined. That evening at dinner, Harriet told stories of the orphanage that made the children's eyes grow wide, tales of thin gruel and cold winters, and the small rebellions that had kept the spirit alive in children whom society had discarded. And Eleanor watched her own children absorbing these truths about their mother's origins, and saw not shame but pride in their faces, for she and Frederick had raised them to understand that worth was not conferred by birth, but earned through character and kindness. When Harriet departed 3 days later with promises to return and invitations for Eleanor to visit her home in Bristol, Eleanor stood on the steps of Thornfield Hall and felt something shift and settle in her heart. A final closing of the circle that had begun 20 years before, when a frightened child had stood on an auction block and waited to learn her fate. She had spent so many years becoming the Duchess of Thornfield, becoming Frederick's wife, and William and Catherine, and Thomas's mother, becoming the woman who managed estates and hosted gatherings and commanded respect from those who had once whispered behind their fans. But Harriet's visit had reminded her that she was also still Eleanor Ashford, the girl who had refused to let cruelty break her spirit. The years that followed Harriet's visit seemed to pass with increasing swiftness, as years do when they are filled with purpose and love, and Eleanor often found herself pausing in the midst of ordinary moments to marvel at the richness of the life she had built from such unpromising beginnings, for she had learned that happiness was not a destination to be reached, but a practice to be cultivated, a choice made fresh each morning when she woke beside Frederick and heard the sounds of their children's voices echoing through the halls of Thornfield. By 1827, William had grown into a young man of 13 whose sense of justice had only deepened with age, and Frederick had begun teaching him the responsibilities that would one day be his as the next Duke of Thornfield, not merely the management of lands and tenants, but the deeper obligation to use privilege in service of those who had none, lessons that Eleanor knew her son absorbed with the same fierce determination that had sustained her through the darkest years of her own youth. Catherine at 11 had announced her intention to become a scholar, a declaration that might have been met with gentle dismissal in another household, but which Frederick and Eleanor encouraged with the same seriousness they would have accorded a son's ambitions, arranging for advanced tutors in mathematics and natural philosophy, and watching with pride as their daughter's mind unfurled like a flower turning toward the sun. Thomas at Nat continued to see the world through an artist's eyes, and his sketches of Thornfield and its inhabitants had begun to show real promise, capturing not merely the appearance of things, but their essence, the way light fell through the library windows, or the particular set of his father's shoulders when deep in thought, and Eleanor had commissioned a proper art master to nurture his gifts because she understood that every child deserved to have their truest self recognized and cultivated. The estate continued to prosper under their joint stewardship, for Eleanor had never relinquished her role in its management, even as her duties as Duchess had multiplied, and she took quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that the innovations she had introduced over the years had improved the lives of hundreds of families who depended on Thornfield's success, the drainage projects and crop rotations and fair rent policies that had become a model for other great estates throughout the county. Frederick at 50 remained the man she had fallen in love with across the gulf of propriety and circumstance, older now and silver threaded through his dark hair, but still possessed of the perceptive intelligence and quiet strength that had seen past her limp and her poverty to the person she truly was, and their partnership had only deepened with the years as they faced together the joys and sorrows that life brought to every family. The illnesses survived, and the losses mourned, and the countless small victories celebrated in the privacy of their shared life. She understood now that the words he had spoken 22 years ago at that dreadful auction had not been a curse but a prophecy, for in taking the lame one he had taken everything, and in being taken she had gained more than she had ever dared to dream possible. The summer of 1830 arrived with golden warmth that seemed to Eleanor a fitting backdrop for the milestone approaching, for in October of that year it would be exactly 25 years since a grief-numbed duke had spoken 5 words that altered the course of 2 lives forever, and she found herself reflecting more often on the strange arithmetic of fate as she walked the familiar paths of Thornfield's gardens, with her left leg still dragging its familiar rhythm against the gravel, a rhythm that had become so much a part of her that she could not imagine moving through the world any other way. Frederick had proposed a celebration to mark the anniversary, a grand ball that would fill Thornfield Hall with light and music and dancing, and though Eleanor had initially demurred, uncomfortable with such public acknowledgment of what remained for her a deeply private miracle, she had eventually yielded to his gentle persuasion and the enthusiastic support of their children, who at 16 and 14 and 12 were old enough now to understand the significance of the occasion, and young enough still to delight in the prospect of a party. William had grown into a young man whose quiet authority reminded Eleanor so strongly of Frederick that her heart sometimes caught when she saw him consulting with the tenants or poring over the estate accounts she had taught him to read, and she knew that Thornfield would pass into capable hands when the time came, hands that understood the responsibility that came with privilege. Catherine at 14 had begun corresponding with scholars at Cambridge who did not know they were exchanging ideas with a girl, and Eleanor suspected that her daughter would find ways to make her mark on the world that would surprise them all, for she had inherited her mother's fierce determination and her father's willingness to defy convention. Thomas had begun his formal art training in London under a master who had declared his talent exceptional, and his portraits of the family captured not merely their likenesses, but the bonds between them, the invisible threads of love and loyalty that held them all together. As October approached and the preparations for the ball consumed the household, Eleanor received a letter from Lady Beatrice Montague requesting permission to attend, and she sat for a long moment with the paper in her hands, remembering the whispered cruelty in a crowded ballroom and the malicious satisfaction on a beautiful face as old wounds were exposed for public entertainment. But when Frederick asked what she wished to do, she found herself saying yes, because she understood now that forgiveness was not about absolving others, but about freeing oneself from the weight of old grievances. The night of the ball, October 15th, 1830, Thornfield Hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, and Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of deep blue silk that matched her eyes, Frederick beside her in evening black that recalled the morning clothes he had worn the day they met. And as they descended together to greet their guests, she felt the ghost of the frightened child she had been watching from somewhere far away, marveling at what time and love had wrought. The ballroom of Thornfield Hall had never looked more magnificent than it did on that anniversary evening, with crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across the polished floors and banks of autumn roses perfuming the air with their deep crimson sweetness. And Eleanor moved through the crowd of 300 guests with the practiced grace she had cultivated over 17 years as Duchess, her limp now so familiar to society that it had become simply part of her distinctive presence rather than a mark of deficiency, though she still caught occasional whispers from those who remembered the scandal of her origins and marveled at the transformation time had wrought. Frederick remained close beside her throughout the evening, his hand finding the small of her back with the easy intimacy of long partnership, and she felt his pride radiating through every introduction, every dance they shared despite her uneven gait, every moment when his eyes met hers across the crowded room with the same intensity that had once declared his love in a summer library so many years ago. Lady Beatrice Montague arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, older now and diminished by the years that had not been kind to her beauty, and Eleanor watched her former tormentor hesitate at the entrance to the ballroom as though uncertain of her welcome, her face showing the lines of a woman who had built her life on cruelty only to find that foundation crumbling as age stripped away the power she had once wielded so carelessly. Eleanor excused herself from the conversation she had been enjoying with Sophia, and crossed the ballroom floor with deliberate purpose, aware that every eye followed her progress, aware that this moment would be remembered and recounted in drawing-rooms throughout England, and when she reached Lady Beatrice, she extended her hand in welcome with a smile that held no malice, only the quiet triumph of a woman who had transcended every limitation society had tried to impose upon her. The words she spoke were simple, a gracious welcome to Thornfield and an expression of pleasure at Lady Beatrice's attendance. But both women understood the deeper meaning beneath the social pleasantries, the acknowledgement that Eleanor had won a victory far more complete than any revenge could have provided, for she had built a life of such evident happiness that her former enemy's cruelty seemed now like the impotent thrashings of a small and frightened soul. Lady Beatrice's eyes glistened with something that might have been shame, or might have been grief for her own wasted years, and she murmured words of congratulation that sounded, for perhaps the first time in her life, entirely sincere, before retreating to a quiet corner where she spent the remainder of the evening watching the festivities with an expression of wistful regret. Later, as the orchestra played a waltz and Frederick led Eleanor onto the floor for the final dance of the evening, she looked up at the face she had loved for so long and felt the accumulated weight of 25 years pressing against her heart like a blessing. The terrified child in the grey wool dress and the confident duchess in blue silk, somehow coexisting in this single moment of perfect joy. He smiled down at her with eyes that still saw everything, the fire that had never dimmed and the strength that had only grown, and she knew that whatever years remained to them would be filled with the same fierce tenderness that had transformed them both.